The Media Project. The Hub co-works. This is your community. This is The Hub. Special membership discount now through March 31st. Find out more at rutlandvermont.com/the-hub-coworks. This is your community. This is The Hub.
Dr. Joe Schlichtman is an urban sociologist and member of the faculty at DePaul University. He spoke with me regarding his experiences living and working in High Point, North Carolina. His experience there is recounted in his 2022 book, ShowRoom City: Real Estate and Resistance in the Furniture Capital of the World. John is motivated by the potential of equitable, just, and productive community development. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, listen, I want to say thanks for coming on. I'm here tonight with Joe Schlichtman, and he is the author of 2022's ShowRoom City. We were just having a great conversation before this, John, and I'd like you to begin with maybe how and why you got to High Point. One of the things I just want to point out before you even start saying anything is how much I respect a person who will say, I need to understand this place better. And talk about completely immersing yourself in High Point, North Carolina.
Yeah, well, that could be thank you so much for having me, Scott. This sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. I could do a whole, show on just that immersion, right? I'm an ethnographer by training, and I teach qualitative methods and ethnographic methods to college students. And so this is what I love to do. And the conclusion that you talk about is something that I come to very easily. Like, there's no way I can understand this without going there. So I was a student at New York. Actually, let me put it this way. I was working for a nonprofit that served unhoused New Yorkers in Manhattan, and they were opening a new 500, I believe it was, unit supportive housing building in Manhattan. And the folks in the building owners in that neighborhood were writing letters to Mayor Giuliani at the time and saying, you better not move homeless people to this neighborhood because we just spent all this time renovating these showrooms and we have visitors coming here from all over the world. I had no idea what they were talking about. But what they said in the letter is, if you don't learn how to treat business right, we're going to move to Atlanta, Dallas, or High Point, North Carolina.
Yeah, and you're saying, where's High Point?
Oh my gosh, like to have High Point be spoken about in New York in relation to Atlanta was extremely strange.
And these are the decades, by the way, just for context, these are the decades in New York City where the economy on the island of Manhattan and throughout the boroughs eventually started to drastically change, and the gentrification was pretty out of control.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was the rise of what some would call super gentrification or hyper gentrification. And so there was a valuing of the city for its aesthetic and how it looked and how it felt and how people experienced it. And that's exactly what these showroom owners in Manhattan were trying to invest in. They were furniture showroom folks, and they brought people from Italy and France and the UK and from San Francisco and LA to look at furniture. And they said, we don't want people our visitors stepping around homeless people when, we're showing them this $10,000 couch. And so, I was interested in this for the justice aspect of it, but I was extremely interested in how the heck this city that I had never heard of had found its way into this sentence.
Right.
And so I began researching it on what existed of the internet at that point, and found out as much information as I could. And one day I said, "What the heck?" And I rented a car at LaGuardia Airport, and it was a Chevy Blazer. Hit a deer on the way down.
Oh my!
Ripped off the front bumper and the back bumper.
This is a very East Coast 95 story. I almost made it out of Virginia.
So I arrived in my Chevy Blazer to visit for 3 days. I was, long story short, absolutely hooked, and moved a few days later. So that first trip into High Point is how I open the book, with all of my reservations when I was going through the non-global parts of High Point, and I was like, this was all just a sham. And then suddenly I begin to see the gleaming buildings in front of me, basically, and see, I mean, literally the road change below me, and realize that something really crazy was happening, and that is that I was approaching the home furnishings capital of the world.
Early on in the book, you talk about these three sort of threads, that speak to some of the issues, right? One is profit in real estate, and how we derive that profitability, how exclusion has shaped our cities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and also just how the idea of global interconnectedness within industries, as we've now it was sitting on at least a quarter century or more of that, and we can see both positive and negative aspects. And these are three threads I think that more than most keep appearing in some of the issues in the book. And it also seems to me like officials in this city for more than a half century have largely divorced themselves from the notion of, stewarding their assets, real estate assets, their citizens, what we generally consider to be the different parts of the ecosystem of a municipality, for a broad spectrum of citizens in mind. In a way it's really what, and you call them an outlier as a city, I think, several times in the book. And it's this idea that like they're the extreme case, but there's a lot we can learn from that, isn't there?
Yeah. High Point is an extreme case, an extreme fabric made of very common threads. And so I think that's what makes it the perfect case to study. And my mentor in the field kind of opens the book with a preface saying, learning from the outlier. And that's my attempt in the book, is to learn from this outlier. Yes, there is a front stage and a backstage in every city. There's places where the Visitors Bureau wants the visitor to go, and there's places where the Visitor Bureau wants the visitor not to go. And there's a politics and an economy in all of that. There's a balance between short-term economic health and long-term economic health. And so when you talk about the ecosystem, whenever you're talking about an ecosystem or a whole, you're talking about something long-term and more enduring and more delicate and more complex.
This is hard for us, isn't it? This is why we look at so much business and say, wow, that was an irrational decision. But we're thinking long-term. The people who made that decision are often thinking by the quarter or by the year, by the, I'm going to live and die by this quarter,
Yes. And there's a short-term fix of tax inflows that are coming from downtown High Point, turning itself over to this global furniture exposition. And we haven't really talked about that at all yet, but, in the 1950s, High Point was a major furniture producer, and had, since the 1920s, a show in which they would show their goods, since and they were one of the early furniture merchandising centers, as well as a major furniture industry center.
No better way to show your retailers your product than you got to see it, right? You got to see the bedroom sets, you got to see the dining room sets, and really the 1920s is when like our modern concept of buying sets and the way we buy furniture has pretty much been the same for about 90 to 100 years, right?
Absolutely. And it was from the 20s to the 60s that it was evolving into a fashion industry, where people did, it wasn't just utilitarian anymore. There was style, and it was more than craft, it was image. And so Chicago had ascended to the top of the furniture exhibition hierarchy with its merchandise mart and its furniture building next door. But High Point, actually took over the crown for the major furniture show, probably in the world. I would say in the world at that time, because they were able to innovate their showrooms since the factory was right down the street. You had the people designing the furniture and the people who were designing the showrooms eating at the same diner. So there was this tremendous innovation that occurred, and the High Point brand of furniture showing became completely different from what was going on elsewhere in the world. And so downtown High Point became a center for showrooms. And when you talk about, going for short-term profit, when you have people from all over the country and eventually, dozens and dozens of other nations bidding on land in your downtown, how is a diner going to compete? How is a dry cleaner going to compete? How is a tailor going to compete? And so when you talk about the short-term vision of local leaders, they were looking for that fix of that tax infusion, because the market, this global exposition called the High Point Market today it's called the High Point Market, only occurs twice a year.
Right.
So furniture manufacturers own or lease the buildings year round, but the buildings are only receiving what it turns out to be 80,000 visitors from around the world, from 100 countries, twice a year. So the downtown's only getting wear and tear twice a year, but the phone is still connected, the electricity is still connected, the gas is still connected, the property tax is still being paid. And so there is this boon, or what politicians there called the golden goose, the goose that was laying the golden eggs, right, that was protected viciously.
And boy, do the developers like it, because, hey, my building basically can be, it's multi-use. Most of them are basically a hollow shell, and they're only used twice a year, so they're not getting a lot of wear and tear. But there's social consequences, of course, of this. And I just have to say, this has got to be the most extreme case. There is no other tourist destination in the United States or anywhere, right? Because we see the kinds of social issues and poverty and so forth in High Point. You see that in a lot of tourist areas where it's difficult for the people who are there, who are making that city or that town happen, to live there. But in High Point's case, their city center, it's the extreme case of Disneyfication, because it's used so little, and yet it's like off limits, and it's created a strange relationship, right, for the people and their downtown, unlike any other city.
Yes, there is a line where, I mean, it's. I will speak as an outsider. There are High Pointers who would laugh at me saying this, and I would say that that's because they're so steeped in their reality. But to me, you actually cross a line from the local to the global. You actually cross a line where you go from having maybe 3 people or 4 people or 5 or 7 people look at a property that's for sale, to dozens and dozens, or maybe even hundreds of people looking at a property that's available. And so, what's amazing is that there were these, they're almost prophetic local leaders who were talking about, Aaron Kleinert is one such leader who deserves a lot of recognition, a local attorney who was talking about the real and the false real estate markets. And he was saying there's this false market for the downtown. So that's what a sociologist would call the internationalized sector. There's that one particular sector of the economy that just has international funds flushing into it, while the other areas of the economy are extremely local. Like, no one's thinking about the the pharmaceutical company in High Point, except for the local regional pharmaceutical people. But everyone, the entire world is bidding on this furniture, real estate, and these furniture functions downtown. So it created a very extreme example, and it created a unique type of poverty. Some of the people who I interview in the book are working at the community college, and the economy in High Point is such that there were some people while I was there, in the 2000s, and I'm sure it's at least the case into the 2010s and maybe even today. But when I was, working in downtown High Point, there were people who worked around the clock for the 2 months in April and October when the exhibition came into town, made $14,000, let's say, and lived on that.
Wow.
Because that was the best source of money.
Talk about hyper seasonality and what that just does to a neighborhood's ecosystem, like the peaks and valleys, right, of cash flow.
Yeah, and yes, spiky, right? I mean, it is, and so it became. You said Disneyfication. It became the ultimate example of a Disneyland, where the city became the cast members, just like Disney World and Disneyland have cast members, because the downtown couldn't support any locally owned restaurants. So the market authority, which is a public-private partnership, the market authority had to develop shell restaurants that became populated during the market. The downtown couldn't generate a year-round quality hotel. So the market authority and its predecessor was the Chamber of Commerce, coordinated home rentals where residents would rent homes so that outsiders could come and stay in these homes.
It's this whole, you do a great job of describing it chapter after chapter of this whole, it's the on button's on it. Everyone has a role to play, and then it just kind of goes away for long periods of time. It's weird. It's expressed in the architectural vernacular of the city too, right? In the city center, because, much like a tourist asset, like a Disney, describe a little bit about the architectural vernacular. It's bizarre.
Well, I heard developers all the time talk about how it was nearly impossible to develop anything outside of downtown High Point, that the city would get all in your business. They would be making all types of demands of you. But anyone developing in downtown High Point had carte blanche. And the more, the more powerful you were, that determined what you could develop. There's a famous example that's, I know one of the attorneys who worked on this case, and I know several people who were there. There was a new building built, and there was a skywalk built between the buildings, and the skywalk was supposed to go across the street, and connect to another building, and then connect to, eventually to the third building that was owned by the same owner as the first building. So, basically you had someone who owned a building, they bought another building across the street, but there was another building in the way. And this other building, the owner of the two buildings would not allow access through the skywalk to this third building. Wow. Because that third building was a competitor. So you go around this building through the skywalk, and this points to another extreme thing here. And that is that the market, as it grew from 1 million square feet to 12 million square feet, was not under some type of convention center management.
Right.
It was a dozen major companies and dozens and dozens and dozens, up to 100 to 200 minor landowners that were all competing with each other to put on the exhibition. So one real estate attorney, Tom Terrell in town, called it the last bastion of free market capitalism. I mean, it was really those, 21 blocks of the downtown, the core downtown, were a fight to the death.
Yeah.
And as you say, kind of looping it back, there was absolutely no concern for the consequences of this.
No, you had a city council and a city government that said, hey, as long as this tax money keeps rolling in. So, I mean, literally calling it the golden goose, but at the expense of so many other things.
SM Graves Associates is partnered with Rove Creations to offer design-build services in residential and mixed-use development. We believe in building neighborhoods from the bottom up. We're dedicated to solving the middle-market housing challenge in both rural and urban environments. If you'd like to engage an innovative and detail-oriented design-build firm, we'd like to hear from you. Find out more at smgravesassociates.com/community development.
This expresses itself with the citizens. I want to go to that if we can for a minute. And I want to cite a specific example. I find it remarkable that, so we should mention that this is the hometown of composer and saxophonist John Coltrane, one of the preeminent mid 20th century jazz musicians. And so at some point, the city decides, and this is all wrapped in making for, an amenity for this central downtown area. And so they pay homage to him with a statue, and I think there's some other green space around that and so forth. What I found striking is the local citizenry, a lot of the reaction was, this is a completely disingenuous. It wasn't that I like John or I didn't. It wasn't that I like jazz or I don't. It's not that. It wasn't a racial thing, right? He happens to be African American. It was, this is a disingenuous act on the part of the city because, and what I want you to speak to this if you can. It seems to me like this is like a clear indication that the people really know, that where the city's bread is buttered, and that they really aren't a part of their own city,
Yeah, so the historian Glenn Chavis, the local historian Glenn Chavis highlighted the fact that Coltrane got out of High Point as soon as he could and forgot about it and never looked back. And mentioned how disconnected Coltrane's family was from High Point, and when they visited, they were like, High Point? I didn't even and so. Chavis was saying there are so many people upon whom's backs, High Point was built.
Yeah.
And he said, to just overlook all of those people for the biggest image, that would be a representation to essentially the market visitors, there is this idea of, there's an insecurity, right? We're trying to be a big league city. The other market centers are Milan and Paris and, and Shanghai. And we're trying to be an exposition that someone could visit on their route through all these other global centers. And so we want to show, in the words of one leader, we want to show people that we have some substance. And so during that time, there was some debate about, who are we going to choose to represent High Point to outsiders. And of course, that's so much more extreme in this case, but every city is creating a narrative. And the question is, who is at the table when this narrative is being constructed, and who's creating the table, who's deciding what the agenda is.
That's right.
So Glenn Chavis, the local historian, was excellent in fighting for the local voices to be elevated to the same degree as the ones that became international voices, such as John Coltrane.
Yeah.
But you can name on one hand the people, you can count on one hand the people who push the envelope like that in High Point, who were basically trying to get more people at the table.
Yeah. And speaking to that now, if we can sort of change a little bit into, because we want to talk about where High Point is today, and also we seek generally on this show about solutions and stuff, or things we can learn from where we've been. And what it seems to me that a lot of effort, especially in the second half of the time period that you're talking about in history, right? So latter half of the last few decades, or the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade or so of the 21st. Lots of people are saying, hey, maybe some solutions are found, in the physical space on the edges of this area, right? And quite often what seems to happen is there's like a tug and a pull where we think, maybe the city gets its own little downtown again, or maybe it's happening in several parts on that perimeter, and then inevitably the market absorbs those buildings. Talk a little bit about that, and maybe even some of the players and just the back and forth, because I feel like people in the moment, they get really frustrated in their own communities when they feel like, we've tried and tried and we've lost again. But people in High Point did not stop and probably continue not to stop. Trying to reclaim a bit of their own downtown.
Yeah, reclaim is the word, and I'm writing a little piece to celebrate a local leader, that same attorney that I talked about by the name of Aaron Kleinert. He led an organization called the Downtown Improvement Committee, and it was just a committee. It had no power. It just had advisory power to the city council. And so I sat on this committee, and his goal during that time was, how can we infuse resident-centered life and basically non-furniture visitor life? I mean, if it's furniture residents, fine, but how can we infuse any type of life in downtown that didn't relate to furniture visitors? So there was Aaron Kleinert who led that committee in the 2000s, but even preceding him, in 1986, there was a mayor, Judy Mendenhall, who said, I don't think it's a good idea. And I'll kind of walk you through these movements, if that's okay.
Please do. No, it's interesting because, again, people get in the moment and some of this stuff takes 40 years to figure out, right? There's a tug and a pull. There's a back and forth. There's wins and losses in the war, but it is, in fact, a war, and it's going to take a long time sometimes, unfortunately.
And that's why I celebrate this person who didn't get paid a dime for any of his work, Aaron Kleinert, who was in all the rooms. He was never he was hardly ever the leader of the room, right? But he was in all the rooms. So in 1986, Mayor Judy Mendenhall said, I don't think it's a good idea that the showrooms are taking up all the buildings in the downtown. Like, okay, so you have a 1 million square foot furniture building, but does a showroom really need to take over the Woolworths? Does a showroom really need to take over the men's tie store?
Yeah. The old theater,
et cetera. Really need to take over the theater? And so she said, this was incredible, in a conservative area. And we'll always hear this tug between conservatism and regulation, but a lot of times it's conservatives who are calling for the regulation. They're just really entrenched in it. And so they understand that in order for it to grow freely later, it's got to be controlled now.
That's right. Yeah.
So Judy Mendenhall was saying, it's not good for showrooms to just take over the entire downtown. Why doesn't the city take over key properties by eminent domain and take them out of the market? So all the property owners got attorneys, and they said, don't you realize the market is the golden goose? Then there was a architectural charrette held in the 1990s that didn't really, no one, that effort really didn't stand much of a chance, but there were a lot of dreams developed for resident-centered uses in the downtown, and it kept the narrative going. It brought in outside experts from major Southern universities to kind of dream about what downtown could be. But at the end of the day, it was decided that downtown should be all furniture showrooms.
Yeah, there's a time and time again in this time period, the Mendenhall administration. Just after that, it is like this. Like, it looks like it's going, but which, by the way, strictly in terms of writing a book, like, it keeps you on the edge of your seat for the whole last third of the book. You're like, oh, it looks like this is going to turn around. Oop, no, it's like that last vote where you go, how did that even get reversed? And you do a really great job, by the way, just expressing, the play-by-play of how that happened. But boy, is that, and it happens in other cities, right? People have experienced this that might be listening. Like, but the difference is it's just like entrepreneurship. You can't give up. You have to go into the next room. You just have to keep it going until you get the votes you want.
Scrapping. I mean, these people were scrapping and hustling and trying to just clawing, So, it was interesting that the whole movement really started off with an elected official, and the top elected official, right, in a mayor. From that point on, that didn't occur again really until the present day. When now Mayor Jay Wagner is leading this effort. But let me take you between 1986 and 2023,
please,
real quick. So Aaron Kleinert in the early 2000s said it's clear that we are not going to develop. It's clear that resident-centered uses, the pizzeria, is not going to compete with showrooms. So let's cover our railroad tracks downtown, our lowered railroad tracks.
Aggressive project, right?
Extremely. Yeah. And let's create 5 blocks of land that is off limits to the furniture industry. Now, that is just absolutely wild that in this city that most people listening to this show have not heard of, that someone says we need to create new land in order to have land.
They literally would have been creating the Big Dig in Boston.
Exactly. Or Battery Park City in New York, or
100%.
But that opened up the idea of, like, we need an off-limits space. Okay, so you're talking about like how movements are born, right? A lot of public officials signed off on that plan, even though it was defeated, overwhelmingly. But this led to talks in the 2010s of creating zoning that said showrooms are not allowed here. And that was called the overlay district in local politics. And that was ultimately defeated when a bunch of out-of-town interests came in and said, like, don't you understand? Like, this is why we're here, is that we can go where we want. If you limit us, we're going to leave. And so the city council backed down and said, well, okay, we won't do it. But there were a lot of people in that room that said, this is only on pause. We can quiet this for now, but this is only on pause because this is the only way forward. Now, in the meantime, to get to your question, back to your question, Aaron Kleinert and others decided to create a substitute downtown on the outskirts. What had been the neighborhood that retail had flowed to when the downtown became off limits, obviously developed some type of critical mass, but it was a strip mall, type critical mass.
Yeah.
And Aaron Kleinert and a nonprofit that was called the City Project came out of the Downtown Improvement Committee, Aaron Kleinert's committee. So this public-private partnership, the City Project, said, we give up downtown. We give up, the overlay effort was defeated. The zoning effort was defeated. We're going to move to a mile north and we're going to create uptown. But there was someone on that board named Jay Wagner who I was interviewing during that time when all this was happening. And he said to me, I sure hope this doesn't mean that we've taken our toys and gone home, because that's where downtown is, where the cluster is. Downtown is where the synergies are. We want to be part of the market. We want to link our year-round furniture-ness with our global 2 times a year furniture-ness. Now, meanwhile, High Point and Greensboro have the highest per capita number of designers in the United States.
It's astounding.
And politicians are blind. I'm telling you, people were telling me this when I first arrived, and I didn't know what they were talking about. Tom Terrell, another real estate attorney, put it this way, the High Point market was never about furniture in the first place. It was about real estate. And I just didn't understand until I understood this full ecosystem. I mean, John Porter, the economist, identified it as John Porter, correct? Michael Porter, the economist, identified High Point as a cluster, which means there's all of these synergies going on there. But all that was visible was the furniture real estate market. And so the substitute downtown said, we're gonna build a residence center down here, north of the downtown. We're going to leave the downtown for the furniture industry. Then the city project says, let's call in architect and urban planner Andres Duany, the father of new urbanism, to see if he can kind of meld all of these worlds.
Evolve Rutland is an organization created by FarVision founders Kiki McShane, Chris Fucci, and William Kelly to focus on prioritizing, developing, and celebrating women leaders in our community.
We believe that when women take leadership roles in communities, start and sustain businesses, and sit on professional boards of directors, the economy improves and communities change for the better. We advocate for fair treatment across the gender spectrum in all business scenarios, including equal compensation, family and medical leave, and equal opportunity for advancement.
Evolve Rutland is continuously working to expand its footprint in the Rutland, Vermont region in order to advocate for, connect, and teach women and non-binary leaders, otherwise referred to as ACT. The funding for Evolve Rutland services has been through private investment of supporters in the community. Join the movement by making your tax-deductible donation and learn more on how you can get involved at farvisionconsulting.com/evolve-rutland.
Now, this is where it gets very, where it really pivots.
And I love this, by the way, because Jay's general posit on this is where the long-term win is, right? That we don't, bifurcate our city. Like, we literally don't say there's one city for one group of people and then there's the city for everybody else. That there has to be a way that all of this space becomes what it needs to become for people. It gets to be defined by everybody in the way that they can use it.
So, there are, just by way of illustration, there are restaurants downtown that only survive through what they call locally price gouging or event pricing, where they would double their menu prices during the market so that they could survive during non-market
Which
times.
leaves people out, right? The locals. It's just another way to leave locals out.
During the market, right? And so there was one restaurant called Rosa Mays on Main Street that did not change its pricing for market, that did not price gouge, as it was called, because that owner said, because these people who are carpenters in these showrooms, transforming them during the market, they eat at my counter during the market and they eat at the counter, in between markets. So I'm not going to change my pricing. It's disrespectful to them. And that man's father had owned one of the first diners in downtown High Point. He had moved from the Chicago market to the High Point market when High Point defeated Chicago in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And so he has a deep lineage. And so he said, my diner is a place where you have the furniture CEO pull up in their chauffeur car,
right? And
you have the furniture carpenter who's here year round. And it's those types of places that Jay Wagner, the current mayor, saw. Even though he wasn't able to save Rosa Mays, he was too late. He saw that this was where what he called the friction occurred, where the messiness of democracy takes place, where the tough conversations take place, where people develop visions because they're in conversations. Visioning doesn't happen in a Thursday night community meeting held by a local city council person where 15 people come. That's important, but visioning is a day-to-day thing that occurs in the diner.
You just sort of sparked in my mind something I hadn't previously thought of in relation to your what you're telling us in the book, which is, because so many of us that are in various economic development projects, what we're trying to do is make the place the best it can be for the locals, not have them be kicked out through gentrification. And at the same time, a place really activates economically when you have a combination of passionate locals and then people from all walks of life from all around you, right? I mean, this is one of the sort of key facets of, the creative class economy. Yeah. They come together, they concentrate in a physical place. And it is exactly that the vision happens because they all get together. And you just pointed out, like, the way that High Point has been doing it, it restricts that. It actually completely stops it.
It's blind to it.
So you can still have great wealth come into a municipality, and yet it's not creating a vibrant ecosystem.
So there's another dreamer who came to town by the name of Elijah Lovejoy, who was a pastor. And he said, this downtown, the city lacks a soul. It's lacking its meaning. It's lacking its identity. So he called it the perfect riddle because of exactly what you're saying. He said, his quote is, you have money, people, and real estate. From a business model, that should be everything you need. You have, 80,000 visitors. You have a $5 billion economic impact. You have 200 furniture buildings owned by people all over the world, totaling 12 million square feet. And eventually, another piece of this story is that private equity would come in and purchase half of this real estate. You have all of this, global investment, but that in and of itself does not automatically, without shepherding, from a pastor, without leadership, without coordination, without visioning, without intentionality,
without humanism, without thinking about what's good for us as people.
Yes.
It turns out the market can't solve all your problems.
Yes. And so this is where Jay Wagner comes in. He was involved in the defeat of the overlay district in 2010. He becomes mayor over he goes from a local attorney, another attorney, to, working on the boards of several of these efforts, to, just being a person speaking up in meetings, and eventually becomes a city council person and then a mayor. And he now starts to talk about reclaiming and what I call the both and. How incredible would it be? There are people in High Point that have this story. They say, I was struggling economically. I had a very limited vision of my world. And I took a temporary job working in the market, and I ran into this global business person or this global designer or that just completely rocked my world with their vision of what could be possible for my life. Right. And so there's one person who I mentioned in the book in particular who said, the market was really beneficial for me because it was a taste of the global in my hometown in a way that you only get if you're in a major global city. And so Jay Wagner is saying, gosh, if we could just, it's going to take a lot, but if we could just hold it all together in one place, then all of this friction and all of this innovation can happen. And so one of the things that's occurring right now, there's a ton. I mean, this is definitely the we've reached the tipping point. And there are now all types of things going on downtown. It used to be like maybe there was one piece of good news per year, and now there's just momentum. There's accumulation of momentum. So, but one of the things that's going on downtown is what's called Plant 7, which is an incubator for small batch furniture production.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So that there were a lot of local craftspeople who began to realize, well, I'm not going to compete with China on these large orders.
Not the commodified stuff, but there's craft stuff, right? There's niche market stuff. Are they working with, with a lot of CAD-driven manufacturing tools and just stuff to really make a small batch work as efficient and as profitable as possible?
Well, this is where the genius comes in, because of the high point market, and because where else, there is nowhere else in the world where you have 80,000 furniture eyes coming through.
Right.
And so they have a very advantageous partnership with a manufacturer of these products from Italy. And so they have an entire floor that has been outfitted for specifically so that these small batch manufacturers don't have to have these capabilities in-house. They have a materials library there for people to look at different materials. And so this is a place where, they are now actively looking for overlap. They are actively trying to fertilize the cluster.
Which, they're extremely empowered to do so and activate that place simply because you do have good bones. You have great city bones, but you also have, say it again, 5 billion with a B, right?
Yeah, of
investment coming in,
impact, yeah.
Twice a year, from the whole ecosystem that is the market, right?
Yes.
And the incubator being one of many just great stories about how things are starting to really turn around.
Yes. And I just want to read a quote about these synergies from Mayor Jay Wagner before he was mayor. And this is the quote I've been alluding to. He said, "Right now, downtown is almost like Disney World during market. And I, for one, refuse to give up on having something downtown for those folks to do when they are here, so that when they walk out of those buildings, they have a place to go eat. They have a place to go socialize. Now, they have places to go eat, but they're fake restaurants. They have clubs to dance at, but they're fake clubs."
Yeah.
So this is what he's saying. They have a place to go socialize. They have a place to go in their downtime to enjoy themselves, and they can do it in a way that it can exist between markets for the people who live here. And so instead of looking at, well, you can't locate downtown because there's only 2 months of activity per year, instead it's, wow, you should locate downtown because look at the bonus that you get during those 2 months. Of course, that involves a critical mass. You can't have, the first person who comes in isn't going to experience that benefit. So this requires an awareness among elected officials. This requires an awareness among local civic leaders and government appointees and civil servants to understand that this is going to take a symphony, an orchestration of people to make that vision happen.
And then we are back to long-term programming, if you will, not just short-term thinking. Most net margin for the least amount of effort.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is what the individual business person could very well want, and it might make perfect sense for them. As one elected official said, you have a couple that's thinking about retiring and selling their dry cleaners business, and you have some exhibitor from South America come and say, we'll buy it for X amount of money. Of course they're going to take that money. Yeah. They have to. They're not the enemy. They're trying to provide for their children. This is not someone rich. They own a dry cleaner in High Point, North Carolina.
Listen, it's the dairy farmer with 300 acres who has struggled his or her entire life and is offered millions for a developer to buy the property. Can you blame them?
Exactly. It's not the individual.
Are they really part of the problem, or is there a greater economy that is the problem?
Exactly.
John, I'm so glad that there's an empowering part of this story, and that that there's all this potential. But I hear from what you're saying, it requires consistency, it requires patience, it requires strategy. Really, what it does is it requires all the things that you need to do those things that are worth doing.
Yes. And, Aaron Kleinert, who led the Downtown Improvement Committee, said, you have to keep rolling that ball uphill. You have to keep rolling that ball uphill. You keep pushing it. You keep pushing it. You keep pushing it. You feel like it's about to roll back on top of you. But if you just get to that peak and that momentum begins, and actually, another lesson here, Aaron Kleinert had poured his wisdom and his battle scars into Jay Wagner. And so it was actually Jay Wagner who picked up that baton. I mean, Aaron Kleinert said, I'm tired. And that's exactly when Jay Wagner said, I refuse. And there's actually a point in the book where Aaron Kleinert says, I don't think we're going to be able to reclaim the downtown, in one interview that I did with him. And then in the interview that I did with Jay Wagner, he happened just by chance, I think, to use the exact same word. We're going to reclaim a piece of that downtown. We're not going to run the furniture market out of town. That would be asinine. Right. But we're going to reclaim, as he said, a piece of that for ourselves.
Yeah.
And so there's coalitions, there's like-minded people who are and this is in a place that was bereft of dreamers. This is a city that considers neighboring Greensboro to be, light years ahead in terms of innovation
and on the other side of the planet too. Even though there's the three cities: is Greensboro, High Point, forgive me, I can't remember Thomasville,
Winston-Salem.
Right? Oh, Winston-Salem, that are all in like this triangular sort of area of, like, you could drive in about an hour and a half in a circle around and get to all three of them.
Yeah, it's a
but it might as well be on the other side of the planet. Yeah, exactly.
And so, the people who were trying to, Elijah Lovejoy, one of the dreamers who came to town that I mentioned, who talked about the perfect riddle, he tried to support himself by creating an events business where he would have parties in the downtown in the furniture spaces. And he felt that this was therapeutic for residents to have a party in the furniture space. He really believed that. And I truly believed it too, because I happened by chance upon one of his parties, and it had a tremendous impact on me seeing resident life in the downtown. But he was trying to do all this. He was trying to monetize all this for his own household through an events business. And he eventually took that events business and started the first outdoor winter ice rink in Greensboro. And it just completely took off and became a huge hit. And this was someone who put his blood, sweat, and tears into High Point and just was not able to stay. It pushed him out. So, the people that did endure, it required tenacity. It required also, in today's parlance, self-care. I'm going to pull back for a few years. I'm going to come back in for a few years.
Knowing when enough is enough. I can attest, having 18 years of trying to do similar work in another furniture making city here in New England, and not being good about that. Like, you have to, if you're going to live another day, right? If you're going to come back for more.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have a happy ending. It seems to be evolving in the right direction for High Point, but that's not necessarily guaranteed, right? It's something that is being cultivated onward,
Yeah, it can completely go left. Now, let me just, as we close here, let me share how it could go left. And that is that Bain Capital, the private equity firm, owns 60% of the downtown.
Wow. A full 60%.
Yeah. So
one hedge fund, not a multiplicity.
One private equity firm. Yeah. So what is, so there were small private equity firms that owned the major buildings. And then they had a roll up, what's called a roll up into Bain. First Bain in 2011, and then today Blackstone owns the 60%.
Oh boy.
So what's interesting about that is that Blackstone is the first downtown landowner to say that we're not going to have a successful furniture exposition unless High Point has a successful furniture downtown, which goes against the thinking of everything my people in community development believe, that private equity comes in and has a sane thought.
Right.
But
It
actually
is rare to happen. Let's be fair to all parties. Right?
Exactly.
It's not because it's not efficient.
Well, yeah, I mean, but this happens to be a long-term, because there's so much different ownership. They only own 60%, and then there's like 100 other landowners, right? That are also in the furniture industry. So they have to cultivate this ecosystem for High Point to have legitimacy. So what they actually did, there was a downtown office building that had been kind of shuffled around between private equity firms, and Blackstone inherited it. They donated it back to the city of High Point to use for explicit resident-centered uses. It actually has a deed restriction for resident-centered uses. So here you have private equity saying you must do something for residents. Now, that is a reality that theory will not teach you. That is a reality that you have to navigate on the ground, and you have to learn on the ground, because, but it just shows you, as I say in the end of the book, there's not only one alternative, there's hundreds of alternatives. And to know the different paths that a place can take, you have to intimately know that place. And so solutions have to come from local wisdom. They have to come from the ground up. Outside views are really important to act as a mirror, but these local views have to percolate up from local wisdom.
I want to thank you for leaving us with such a good ending to the story, at least where it is now. And it seems like it's being stewarded in the right direction, leaving us with hope, and leaving us with a lot of good lessons learned. My guest today, author Joe Schlichtman. The book is ShowRoom City. It came out last year. If you have any interest in urbanism and in what to do in your city, if you're stuck in a long-term issue, and even if it's whether it's guidance or you just need to hear, hey, this is possible and we can do it, and here's a few ways you might glean some information that's useful, I implore you to get the book. John, thank you for coming on the show. We're going to make sure people can get a hold of where to get the book and how to get a hold of you. Any final thoughts? Any final wisdom you'd like to impart, or maybe you can tell us what's next.
Wow. So I am working on my third book. My first book was on gentrification, and really on all solutions involve reinvestment, and all reinvestment has strictly sides to it, right? Anytime you invite reinvestment, there's all sorts of things that can go right, and there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. So what I'm working on right now is kind of a way for us to categorize different attempts, much like we see in the closing sections of High Point, when ShowRoom City, when we look at the different movements in High Point, the ways that money can be withdrawn from a place, the way that investment can be withdrawn from a place, and what I call the Ds, devaluing, defunding. I look at 11 or 12 Ds, and then I look at all of the ways that money can be brought back, or investment can be brought back into a place, rebranding, revaluing, refunding, and look at how the choices that are made, both in the ways that money is removed and the ways that investment is brought back, really influence outcomes. So I'm hoping it's something that can be useful to local practitioners as a way to, much like I hope this book is, ShowRoom City, to organize our thoughts in the way we think about disinvestment, development, and redevelopment.
This sounds like a great book. This ShowRoom City is a great book. This sounds like a really great book as well, because it is, in fact, I agree with you. These are man-made problems, right? Like, these are choices we're making, and we've got to get ourselves focused on the right choices, and then demand to make them happen, and we manifest them ourselves, and we don't stop until we get them, which is, it just parallels the basics of good entrepreneurship, right? Those who achieve are the ones that just didn't stop. Everyone gets told no, everyone hits roadblocks, but you just can't stop until the right things happen.
Yes. I mean, what I say to anyone who will listen is that all spaces are an accumulation of human decisions, right? And so you can't make decisions going forward until you look at the decisions that accumulated from the past. But also, we make up spaces. If there were no longer humans around, these spaces would disappear. We're creating them, right? And that's one thing that high pointers really had to internalize, is that, wait a second, we did this. We can undo this. We did this with our votes.
Right.
We put these people in office and kept them there. We can undo this with our votes.
Right. That's right. John, thanks for coming on the show.
Scott, it's been an utter pleasure. Thank you very much.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.